activities over the past year or so, before swiftly coming to the section where we'll walk you through kind of some of the impacts of the Open Networks program on both the kind of industry and the network as a whole, so before concluding with an open Q&A session. But as a reminder, we do encourage people to kind of raise questions as they come to mind throughout the session. So please don't wait until that final section, but that's just a moment to kind of reflect upon everything and have an open discussion with the group. I think those are the only points I had to cover. So one other point as well, the session is going to run for just slightly over an hour. So we have not scheduled a break so that we can hopefully just give you a bit of time back of your day and make this a really focused session. So hopefully there's no objections to that before I hand over to yourself, Abby, to take us through the session today.
Thank you so much, Rees. As Rees mentioned, my name is Avi Aital. I'm the head of Open Networks, and I'm here for most of the session, taking you through the journey what we've gone through as Open Networks. And I'm speaking as a spokesperson of all the subject matter experts and the networks who spent years and a lot of time to get us where we are now. While it's quite a privilege to be here as that spokesperson, but it is a collective effort that I'd like to flag. So any questions you have, I'll do my best to answer them. But if there are some nuances that I don't pick up, I'll be happy to take them away, have a chat with the SMEs and get back to you offline. As Rees mentioned, I'm more than happy for you to ask questions as I'm going through the slides, because the purpose of this is to engage with the stakeholders. So there's no point in just me going away on a monologue for 60 odd minutes, which is not useful for you folks. So feel free to ask these questions. Also, like Rees mentioned, we have the actual calendar slot for 90 minutes blocked. I had these slides planned out for about 60 to 70 odd minutes. Happy to navigate that through the questions we get along there. So we do have that buffer at the end if we need. So with that background, just kicking off, for context, just by way of introduction, ENA is the trade body that represents both electricity and gas members, transmission and distribution in the UK. And the program, that's the Open Networks program, is one of the key programs that ENA is currently being led across the UK as a whole, fed through by all the members for us as and when appropriate. Jumping straight into the main point of this session, we are in the Insights Forum of Open Networks, so most of my conversation will be related specifically to the Open Networks journey. And the reason we've used this journey quite often is the fact that whilst we've structured ourselves as a program that looks at key areas and content, quite often the overall trajectory we've taken is lost. So the way I've framed today's session is functionally to take us through the journey of where we started and have hopefully where we've gotten, but obviously emphasis on the outcomes are delivering on the most recent times rather than dwell on past of what we've done in, say, 2018, for instance. But for context, we kicked off the program back in 2017, the cusp of the first Smart System Flex plan. And this was an opportunity for all the networks to come together such that our collective efforts are greater than the individual parts. So we use the Net Zero Mandate, Smart System Flex plan, and the stakeholder feedback and key steer from Ofgem and DESNZ and the steering group at the time to come together as a collective to essentially prepare ourselves and develop and deploy what we call smart and flexible energy system. As a subset of that, obviously, from a more granular level, it is all informing the distribution system operation transition, which from the current ED2 is being deployed or BAU as far as the regulatory regime is concerned, and then establishing the local flex market or demand response, and then that whatever sits behind it. Although I have flagged here, getting to connect faster and open data. So historically, we had these areas of work, but as we've progressed down the road of developing these things, the volume of work and the importance of it have grown. So we've diversified that to standalone programs within ENA, which you can probably access, via our other channels out there within the ENA forums. But giving that as a key background, so focus of the past few years has been essentially setting up the local flex market. And I've taken an effort to sort of characterize the local or the flexibility market in Great Britain. I see a lot of subject matter experts on call, so don't call me out on the broad brushstroke assumptions I've made to sort of capture this in one slide, because it is quite a difficult task to put the entire flex market on one slide, but it has helped me sort of bring in the conversation just to characterize what we do, where does it all fit in. So just for context, I've split up into explicit and implicit market. Explicit being where there's a need within the network, and the networks, whether it's system operator or distribution or a national system operator, wherein they go away, reach out to a service provider, contract with them, and dispatch the service. On the other side, it's if you go down the route of something that's more implied based on signals and state of play, where it's not necessarily contract and dispatch, is on the implicit side. So on the national side, which is predominantly managed by NESO, a national, formerly energy system, electricity system operator, is all the ancillary service and capacity market. Then on the right, where you see the congestion management, that's predominantly the market that's managed and deployed by the DNOs. And that has been the main remit of Open Networks for quite some time, wherein we made it our ambition to essentially develop that and deploy that in UK as a whole. And underneath that, I've also written the RDPs, which are currently, being led by several of the DNOs right now, which fit into the same ballpark of what we're doing, but doesn't necessarily come within the remit of the program as such. On the right, there's also a lot of work going on in case of whether it's the REMA consultation and the conversation that's live there. And on the right, on the locational and retail market, several Ofgem's initiatives right now are pushing towards development of setting up the domestic side of things. How do you mobilize that? So one thing to call out on this is each of these are managed by certain entities, and one of the ambitions is to sort of bring it all together, and that's the state of play for us. So as our remit goes, we are currently looking to develop the congestion market and then also ensure that that market can then be worked across the other markets. Like, how do we then, as a network flex service participant, how do I then place myself wherein I can participate in multiple markets? So that's the high level remit of what we do. I've also written those two orange boxes down below, the secondary trading and peer-to-peer. So they are perhaps slightly more on the horizon, wherein we think there is potential, but it's too early in the it's probably more on the academic side or something that we are currently keeping an eye out on rather than looking to deploy something in earnest right now. So that's what we would call in the more innovation space. And for context, secondary trading could be trading of actual contracts or flexibility, or it could be secondary trading of capacity as well, where there are capacity congestions. One entity which doesn't use the firm capacity can then offer up that services or that particular capacity to somebody else, for instance. So keeping that in mind, so now having established the landscape, what is it that we do is something that I want to capture. So we have been on a journey, and back in 2018-20, we got together to essentially come together to understand, is there a business case for local flex at all? And we came together as a collective to sign up for the commitment that flex first is the way to go forward. So all the networks are currently committed to testing the market first before they then deploy the counterfactual methods. So having done that, our next task was obviously to establish market principles. And from then on, we then moved up to developing the technical and the procedures that then sit behind to enable this. So back in 2022, predominantly all the processes were pretty much set. It was from a network perspective, it was BAU. So from 2023-24 onwards, we were at a place where we functionally needed to focus our energy on improving the performance and the liquidity of that market. So depending on the diversity of the audience, quite often I like to explain what we do as congestion management. That's like saying, managing traffic on a roundabout. So it's a way of incentivizing certain sort of vehicles, let's say, who are at the roundabout, which brings out the nuance, the fact that for this market to flourish, we need to have the right assets at the right time at the right place. So there are things that we need to do to make that happen. So in 2023-24, we are currently dealing with the challenges of, again, using, sort of stretching my example further. So over the last 2 years, we've spent a lot of effort in bringing as many, understated or underrepresented or low carbon technologies onto the road in my example. So now we do have as many vehicles as possible on the road. And now we are currently coming up with the rules and managing traffic and how do you then automate it and then make it more swift. So the opportunity right now is to essentially improve market participation. That means have more and more people engage and participate in the market, improve transparency, which means whether it's in process, whether it's in trust in the market and the processes, and then perhaps more inward facing is improved coordination across the different entities. When I say entities, it could be network to network, it could be network to regulator, it could be network to stakeholder. The coordination is essential because there is no market without market participants, and that is something that's been very, very clear to us. So keeping that in mind, what we did was we have essentially set ourselves up with an ambition to say we are going to be removing barriers to participate in local flex market and also bringing the wider stakeholders into the decision making process, because what we've done in the past 4 years was useful. We set up the platform for the flourish of the market, but we can't go any further without having the conversation with the stakeholders and identifying what is getting in the way of them participating or making their offerings more lucrative. So the approach we've taken has been probably something I capture in this slide. Is it's something we've gone in steps. So we work with the stakeholders. We have something called a challenge group and multiple forums that we engage with, one insights forum and focus groups and the likes. So we have multiple forums because of either availability or expertise or just the preference of levels of engagement. So we collate all of that as much as possible, and we then have a list of aspects that we think have been handed down to us as key challenges or barriers for the flourishment of the program or the flex market. We then sit internally and prioritize based on what's urgent, what's important, and also what is the capacity and resource that we have available that we can then deploy on this. Because having, it's all well and good to say here are 100 different priorities for us, but we need to be able to triage that to say here are the high impact and urgent items. So that's a conversation we typically have with all the networks and the regulator and the government as well, so that if there are things that we are missing out or some of the voices we've not heard, we're taking that on board. And not to mention, there are a lot of policy decision consultations that are currently underway as well. So here in this, some of them are informative, some of them are things that we need to keep an eye out on, so that feeds in as well. So I do see some of the comments coming in. I don't have access to comment just now. If the question, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. I'll answer right away. But if not, Reese, if you can probably pick that up in the next pause, and we can answer that as well if there are questions.
Yeah, sure. I'll read it out at the next juncture.
Absolutely. Thank you. So after concluding our steps 1 and 2, we go down the route of having identified a priority. We need to be clear on the objectives and outcomes. So this is a reflection of over the past 2 years, where historically we've developed a lot of content, but that was seen as a good practice guide that perhaps sits in a repository somewhere, and it's either not accessible or not necessarily used in the way it was originally intended. And this is a sort of a reality check for us when we received this feedback. So we then put our minds together to see that, okay, we probably need to focus on the outcome, as in what does that mean for the customer at the end of this journey, as opposed to here's the best practice guide, which may or may not practice sort of thing. So we've been quite aggressive in what we do commit and how we go about deploying. There are nuances, I suppose, that we can touch upon in my later on slides, but we try to be as clear as possible as what it is that we're trying to deliver at the end of this journey. And that's something we work with the external stakeholders as well. When I say external, I mean non-network stakeholders, because quite often the way we go about this program, I'll touch upon in the next few slides, is predominantly through subject matter experts from the network. So we then use the available inputs from the challenge group and the other forums we get to sense check some of these outcomes to see whether they are valid and fit for purpose. We then work along with the subject matter experts and the key industry experts to co-develop it. Some of the slides will be quite explicit about that as well. And then once we all converge on some of the commonalities and the approach, we then pass on to the networks to deploy. And during the deployment, we have some learning we can then reflect back in our prioritization and identification of next work. And the last but not least is the governance process of some of these things, because we have been on this journey for a while, and I think it was signposted in Ofgem's consultation document as well. The way we tend to go as an industry, there's a point of divergence where innovation is key. And then having reached an point of inflection, we then converge back to a point where where we think is a point of optimization or best point to converge on. So to manage that process up and down, we then try to have this governance process in place, wherein how do we then ensure that we don't deviate from the standard we then approach? How often do we review it? What are the processes for it? That's something in the back end we do. It's perhaps less accessible to the external stakeholders, but it's crucial for us to maintain the consistency of user experience as a whole. So a quick overview before I go into the details of it is that we've tried to capture our 3 main focus areas. Like I said, make it easier to participate, improve transparency, and improve coordination. Underneath that, we've we've tackled several of these individual focus areas. The main outcomes for us was predominantly consistent user experience or standardization has been identified as the big ticket item from ease of participation. In terms of transparency, it's quite often the rules and data that's going within the systems. And in terms of coordination, it's about what processes are followed and how much of this is accessible to the external stakeholder to scrutinize and understand what's happening in the background, whether it's access of information or access of process and clarity of the steps that we undertake in order to come to a point of decision. This is the high level remit of what we have been doing over the past 18 odd months. And it is quite a lot. And I'll touch upon some of these things in slightly more detail in the slides to come. But in all this, what I would like to flag is the amount of effort and time people invest on this as a collective. So it comes again to say that there are 120 subject matter experts from across the 8 networks, including system operator and DNO, TO, and all the likes to come together. And we typically deliver this through working groups where we identify the subject matter experts who are required to talk about each of these topics, take them forward, and then access the external stakeholder groups to, based on their availability, understanding, interest, to then feed in the input as much as possible. So this is quite an ambitious program. So quite often the challenge has been, the outcomes are not necessarily as fast. It's probably because of the institutional size of this entire ambitious targets we set ourselves. Because if you're going to change a system as a GBPLC, it's not about just issuing a document, it's all done. So that nuance and that criticality is something I would like to I guess bring out, and also like to acknowledge the effort that the networks squad, the regulator and Department of Energy who contributed in this journey to be acknowledged front and center. But I'll pause here before I go to the kind of details of some of these outcomes. If you have any questions, Reese, on the chat, or if anybody wants to raise their hand, please fire away.
Yeah, thanks, Avi. There was a question regards to the flexibility market slide that you had. So flex markets on one page.
Right.
There's a question that reactive power is listed under ancillary services. Does this mean that other markets will not have reactive power? Will congestion management not use reactive power?
So it's not to say what they will or will not. This was a state of play as things are. So in the program, we did review the reactive power on a distribution level, and it was seen that perhaps there either isn't an urgent need or perhaps there isn't an adequate availability to make that a standard. But from our side, we are keeping an eye out, saying that if and when that becomes necessary, we're more than happy to bring that in. So the point I would like to take away, it's not that it will not be. At the moment, it is not, is the way I would read it.
Thanks, Avi. Paul?
Yes, thank you. So I'm quite new to this, so apologies if it's already been raised or covered. But on the next slide, when you look at improving participation, one thing that doesn't seem to be on there is incentives to participate. I don't know what discussion or information on that is available.
Yes. So I think the incentive, we've not quantified that, Paul, but I think the way we are approaching it is that in order for a market to flourish, it has to be obviously market participant and the market operator. So quite often, most of our engagement is voluntary. It's not like we have a remuneration for participation, but the opportunity for you to come along and have a conversation of what is it that the barriers are and how it is that we can address that is something that we're currently focusing on. But do you have any suggestion of when you see incentive to participate? What do you have in mind? What incentives are you asking for?
So yeah, I'm sorry, not clear on that because on I don't know if there is a remuneration or just other benefits to participants. Really, that's kind of my question. What is the incentive?
The incentive is the outcome itself, in my view, because if the market is consistent, and then every asset developer will then be able to access the market and get better returns for their assets. So it is what we want to build a symbiotic sort of relationship, because it is in interest of the market participant and the market operator to come together to deploy this, because it's a win-win. So our view is that, if you are facing something, come along and tell us, because it's in your interest and ours, because we need to understand what barriers are there you're facing, and equally what is it. And if we do remove those barriers, you are then able to optimize the revenue streams for the assets that you potentially have. So that's the kind of way we approach it. But I'm happy to reflect that and make that something that we can, be more explicit and be more articulate on that going forward. Thanks, Paul. That's really useful.
No problem.
Any other questions?
No more in the chat, Avi.
Okay. Moving on then. So I have three of the main outcomes that I've highlighted there is standardization essentially of flexibility products that we procure, the pre-qualification process, and the agreement that the networks use to then contract these flexibility. I'll go through each of them individually. So pre-qualification is something that every asset needs to undergo in order for them to participate in the market. And historically, since the launch of this entire exercise, each DNO have gone away and deployed their criteria for the pre-qualification. Whilst most of the information required were pretty much the same, because end of the day, we're all operating the market, the feel and the feedback that received was that essentially that the approach taken is not necessarily consistent across. So as a flex service provider, the amount of effort they need to put for individual DNOs is compounding because it's not identical. So since then, we've been trying to come up with standard, data layers for commercial and technical. And now, with the we worked a lot with the stakeholders over the last year to come up with a genuinely consistent process. So the way we've gone about that is here's a summary in one slide. So before we set out on this journey, so each network had different number of questions they would ask. So potentially anywhere ranging from 17 to 80 on a commercial side, and again 16 to I guess 60 odd in the technical side, which meant that if a flex service provider is essentially accessing market for all the DNOs, they then had to prepare for 560 separate questions in order to access that market to actually just qualify their asset. And that was deemed to be a huge overhead in any organization, because every time they need to register per DNO, they need to prepare separately. So having reviewed that entire journey and understood the barrier, what we've then come about is consistency across all the DNOs, where we now have 31 standard questions for commercial qualification and 35 for technical qualification, where all the fields and the content of individual responses are fixed. So whether it's deployed through an actual platform or whether it's an Excel sheet, given that it's genuinely consistent in terms of what information is being asked and in what format and what is the information that the flex service provider will put there, we think that's a huge win for us. So this is currently being deployed through all the platforms that the networks then use to advertise and to secure the launch their tenders. So that could be the likes of say Piccolo or Electron or EPEX or the Flex Power, for instance. So each of them have embedded this such that whichever DNO you are accessing market for, you then have the same set of questions you will answer. So this is the kind of approach where we meant by consistent user experience standardization. But one other caveat I would like to say, by standardization, I don't mean like a grid code or some such. Standardization is harmonization or consistency of approach rather than codifying it. But it's not to say we don't or will not codify it, but it's a case of where and when appropriate, we will then do that. There are a few outcomes that we have looked to codify, which I'll touch upon. But I just want to be clear that when I say standardization, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's got embedded in some sort of Dakusa right away. It could be eventually, but as of now, it's only a deployment of a process that's consistent across all DNOs. So this is the pre-qualification and process. So in terms of technical, some of the benefits, I have a lot of slides here. I'm hoping to use that as notes for somebody who wants to take this offline and read through it. I don't intend to read every single benefit, for example, one size fits all approach or whatever it is, but I am more than happy for you to engage with it offline and reach out to me if you have any questions, whether understanding these slides or you want to understand something more of the topic itself. So that's what I had for pre-qualification. So we have, as things stand, the DNOs have currently deployed this across all the markets right now. The status of each of this, you can be able to see that directly on the Open Networks website, which will be launching shortly. We are the final sign off within ENA. You'll have that in the next couple of days. You'll have the tracker of every outcome that we've currently put out there will be live on the website for you to see the state of play. But as of now, I can confirm that the pre-qualification has been deployed by all networks and is currently in use for all assets that are currently looking to access the market. Any questions before I jump to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, this is Pat Brown, and I'm just curious, when I look at that technical line there are so many places where the technical kind of information DER characteristics, generation characteristics in general, are required, tracked by or shared by distribution network operators.
Mhm.
And I just wondered if there was thought given to coordinating with those things, LTDS, the ECR, distribution planning code, data exchanges. There's just a plethora.
So absolutely, Pat. I think that's certainly not lost on any of the networks. And one of the aspect of our work when I mentioned was improve in coordination. Obviously, the data flows sit in there. This is predominantly external facing, where at the time of qualifying assets, these are the bare minimum sets of information we need, and we're making that consistent. Because in order for us to run the program itself, there are a lot of information that's needed, and that has its own, I guess, processes in place and the way it's exchanged. But point is absolutely valid.
Yeah, it's really important to get that information from the connector, right? From
Yes.
the generator, from the DER, whatever, so that it then is available to be utilized as it needs to be and reported on. Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pat.
We're having a question in the chat, Abby, from John Lucas. They're asking, do you think there's potential for national flex markets to align their pre-qualification with the DNO standard?
I think the short answer is that's how we've approached it, wherein we are trying to make it as consistent as possible, and wherever applicable for ESO, we can go and align that. But I don't think it's a one size fits all given the diversity of products within the ESO market. But I did see some of our ESO colleagues on the call. So if you have any other view on it, please feel free to jump in. But from my understanding is that when we went down this journey, we were trying to make it as considered as possible across. And wherever possible, we have done that, noting the diversity of products in ESO's portfolio.
Thanks, Abby. Any more questions before we move on? No,
Okay.
Back to you, Abby.
The next big item that we were tackling with was the standard agreement, the contracts that each of the networks use to procure the flexibility I spoke of. So this is similar to John's question earlier. We were trying to ensure that the agreement that is used by flex service provider is something that can be across the market consistent as much as possible, and ideally not per tender. So we were approach of making it as consistent as possible and as less resource intensive as possible. Because one of the challenges that the flex service providers were very clear to us was the fact that every time there's a tender negotiation and the contracts are new, that then calls for a legal review and whole added time and cost associated with it. So our ambition was, in the interest of making it quicker, we should probably migrate from a standard agreement to a sort of a framework approach, and then try to keep it consistent such that the overheads for perhaps the smaller flex service provider who can't invest a lot on legal fees is something that was flagged as a substantial barrier. So we've been on this journey for a while. We've just launched version 3, which I'll come on. So from the journey we started on, initially we had per DNO agreement, per service, per tender round, and it was ESO. So from then on, when we came with the standard agreement, that was first one what we launched around version 1.2. The 0.2 was the iterative one with amendments in some of the words, where we then had standard DNO terms introduced, wherein each DNO would do it. It was still an agreement per tender round, but then the terms were consistent. The next round, which was a substantial update, was a version 2, which was set out around to be an ambition, like move it to a framework agreement of sorts, wherein the flex service provider essentially signs up on one occasion and then can participate across the different tenders, or depending on whenever the DNO then launches over the fixed period of time. That then is a substantial benefit for us, and it reduces the number of iteration that this needs to go through. And this then had individual service terms for DNO and the individual ESOs, the services as well. The next one is version 2.1. So this is an interim version where we introduced where we had something called primacy, which I'll touch upon, the rules that we had developed. And it was deemed that we need some clause within the agreement for us to go away and deploy that. So we introduced some amendments there and updated some terms and initial alignment of schedules, as well as a low-hanging fruit in some levels where we introduced that, and that was then launched in 2023. Right now, version 2.0, version 2.1 are the major versions that between ESO and DNOs were predominantly been using. We've just about launched version 3 that's I think launched a month ago, and this is following a substantial amount of stakeholder engagement. It is clear to us that there are some concerns still being raised on version 3 that we are currently working with, because our intention was to ensure as much as possible to have this as a stable version going forward. But it's a learning experience. Like in each attempt, there are improvements, but equally as we go with this, there are still better things we can strive to do. So we are currently in conversation. And I know for a fact that I think NPG are the ones who are going live with this first, and they're currently trying to deploy this and getting the feedback on the actual market participants. And this is perhaps comes back to my original point of participation, because while the conversation when you're deploying these contracts, the feedback you get are obviously very relevant. It's quite often we may not necessarily always tap into that level of scrutiny from the stakeholder when we are developing this. And that's probably my call and appeal for everybody on call here, is that this is where the input of the stakeholders are crucial while developing this, because the more detailed thought you give into this, it's more easier and simpler it's going to be as a journey for us. Whilst we are committed to going away and listening to it and fixing this, and I think from a network's perspective, it's obviously essential for them to do it. Even as a program, we are committed to do it, but there's still an opportunity for us to improve that level of engagement, because we want to hear all of it and as much of it when we are actually developing this, as opposed to when we're planning for the next step to only realize like, oh, we probably missed out something earlier. But having noted that, there is still a substantial jump from the version 2. Some of the key changes I've flagged here. Again, I don't intend to go through all of them, but I guess some of the big ticket items were like liabilities. Historically, the liabilities on the FSPs were uncapped, and now we've gone away and established a cap has been introduced for that, so that the liabilities is more clear and something that they can factor in. And whether it's case of some areas where there could not be compliance, for example, cyber security. Right now, each DNO have individual company policies for the cyber security. So we've then used the standard wordings to say that this will then be deployed by individual network priorities as such. And then in site access, there were some wording corrections in terms of who and when the access of those domestic sites or the FSP sites will be granted to DNOs and what basis. So these are the consistency that we've managed to deploy. And whilst we have not taken the shortcut of moving everything to service terms where each DNO can then add the variation, I want to believe that everybody is brought their best game to the conversation to say, okay, this is where we all can hold the line. This is where we all can't necessarily give up. It's probably worth noting that every DNO has a different business case, a different appetite for risk, and obviously different policies when it comes to cyber and certain other aspects of it. So whilst we are navigating the diversity of individual businesses, it's still a huge achievement in terms of from a flex service providers accessing the market. It's quite a substantial update and a journey for us in general as well. So this is the update from the standard flex products. The version 3 is now live on the website, along with the rationale and the feedback received in the consultation, with clear articulation of what has been changed from version 2.1 to version 3, so that if somebody is in the market and now we are going to be accessing version 3, so you just know what has changed, so that you no longer have to repeat the exercise of reviewed all over again. I'd like to flag that at the moment, the process followed by ESO is more onerous than perhaps for DNO. So the ESO continues to use version 2 till they're able to go away and finish their due diligence in terms of the regulatory requirement for their consultation before their deployment. But the ambition is to essentially converge on to a consistent contract at the very end. And we hope to have this as a stable contract for foreseeable future, so long as we're able to cover off all the current feedback we're receiving when the tenders have been launched, and that will allow for market to go away and consume this and give us feedback on it, and we'll review the feedback again in a year's time to see if there's a need for another update. Because one of the feedback we received was too many changes too fast is also not ideal, because you would have just finished the entire process only to find out that there's a new version just imminent and at the cusp of it, and all the effort has then gone down the drain. So we want to be sure that we are able to optimize the balance of pace and the materiality of the changes we're making in each of these versions. Again, I'll pause here before I go to the next point. Any questions? Just to note, I do see quite a few of my network colleagues, and also I think I saw a few colleagues from Offsem here as well. This is genuinely meant to be something that we're all working together on. The way I'm presenting it is more a case of dissemination given the diversity of audience, but by no means am I limiting this conversation. So feel free to add or correct if I misrepresented anything, or if you have a different take or different view of it, because that's crucial for us to go away and work together. Okay. Oh. Sandy?
Hi, yeah, Sandy from EDF. I had a quick question on the contract standard agreement evolution. So you mentioned about V2, now we have V3. Any sort of eventual version that comes through is let's say, for example, I sign V2 and now V3 comes out, and then future if it's a V4. Do you think it's something for the Open Networks program to look at to try and migrate, or is it even appropriate to sort of migrate us onto the most up-to-date standard agreement, wherever that may be? So let's say I sign V3 now for a certain DNO, and then they release V4. Do you think there's some sort of standardized way of trying to always be on the most up-to-date standard agreement?
Yes, absolutely, Sandy. I think the current commitment is that all DNOs will deploy version 3 in their next round of tenders. It's just that I think it's incidental that NPG have launched a tender as soon as they have in the current timeline of things. But the expectation is that if from now on, as in the day it's launched, for whatever tenders to come, it'll probably be version 3 that's being deployed. I guess the challenge that I was trying to flag is that if the feedback received by each DNO when they go out with version 3 from each of the flex service providers is different, that's probably when we'll start, there'll be some challenges. But our ambition is to collate all that and ensure that we are then able to bring all that together in the next version, which is it's not going to be right away, because we want that level of like I said, stagnation in the contracts, so that we get the best amount of feedback and also allow for a stable version to remain there for a while.
Okay, yeah. And I guess just to confirm then that, the standard agreements is almost standard enough that, let's say we participate in NPG's tender, sign V3, and then if we're successful, have those standardized products that we flex under V3, but then in 2 years' time, if NPG come out with V4 with a future tender and we sign V4 and there are products under that, I guess is the standard agreement standard enough that those older standardized products that we're optimizing under V3 can be moved on to V4, if that makes sense. Sorry, that don't know if I've made much sense there, but
I think it did, and I think that is the intent, and we can. I don't know if I'm using it right, but I think backward compatibility is perhaps.
Yes, that's that's exactly the word. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
So I think that is certainly the case, because we don't want to be in a place where now we've done this, that and we undo the work in the past. It's always been incremental and constructive. So it's not to say that by introducing something we're now disqualifying something that we've done in the past or agreed in the past. That's why it's a case of trying to optimize the time invested, whether it's legal or commercial reviews, is what I had in mind. But if your experience has been different, then please do flag to the network member or to me directly. Then we can pick that up in the right forum and see if that's how we tackle that.
Okay.
Nina?
Yeah, really helpful to see it all set out nice and clearly, like super appreciated. I wanted to ask 2 quick clarification questions, if that's all right.
Yes.
So the V3 that's highlighted green, that one is live now and being used, or is the thing we're doing next?
It's live now. We've launched version 3 last month, and NPG are the first to use it because they've gone live with the tender now. Every DNO, based on whenever the next tender launches, the ambition is to use version 3. The caveat is that with every tender that's being launched, now there are conversations that's currently underway with each of the FSPs, and we don't know whether the feedback we're getting are the new ones or the old ones. That's something we're currently reviewing. That's the caveat. But every DNO after I think March of 2024, we are committed to using version 3. ESO are using version 2 and will move to version 3 following their their due diligence.
Okay, so the ESO is still on version 2, maybe 2.1, 2.
2.0.
And is doing due diligence and will then decide about moving to version 3.
Version 3, that's correct, yes.
Awesome. That's really helpful for my understanding. Do you have a sense of timelines on the ESO due diligence? I know there's a lot of detail.
I mean, it's
behind
under
all of
review
this.
right now. There's nothing that we've received a formal commitment on, so I don't have a thing I can disclose.
Cool. Yeah, no problem, no problem. And the next slide, my favorite pet topic area, registration of assets. With the change you've said, so this is a change that is in V3 and is live going forward, that the providers should use reasonable endeavours. So it's an obligation on providers. And then also that there will be clarity of if there is a duplication, how it will be dealt with. So I just wanted to understand, do you have a sense of what kind of reasonable endeavours providers are going to be able to do? And on the dealing with the duplication, are there rules written in then that are very easy to follow, or like what's the detail there?
I probably need to get in the experts on this. From a high level, there are no detailed rules because of the fact that we know that this is an emerging challenge. I know several of the stakeholders have said that, you'll participate everywhere, but from a network's perspective, they're only realizing that same asset has been offered in 2-3 tenders, and that's how do we sort of square this circle is the question. So at the moment, we've passed this on to say, from your side, can you make it clear? And then we hope to pick that up and see how do we manage that. But as things stand, there is no clear explicit rule 1, rule 2, rule 3, which says you are then compliant and not compliant.
Okay, so
during our conversation with the stakeholders, we've sort of spoken of what the reasonable endeavors could be. It could very well be that we've just articulation of what is being done or based on our understanding here of the assets kind of thing. But it's not explicit as far as I understand. But for the moment, I wouldn't quote that as the reason. I can take that away and get back to you, Nina, if that's a specific area of interest for you.
Yeah, no, it definitely is cool. That's fine for now, and definitely clear like recognition of the problem and desire towards solution, and maybe like starting to get them there, but not clear hard and fast yet, which is fine. Just always good to understand current situation. And yeah, definitely a specialist area of interest, and there will be upcoming consultations, so keep an eye out if it is for anyone else as well.
Understood. Nice. I think Reese may have something to add. Just one moment, Sandy. I know your hand's up, but I'm fairly certain Reese has something to say on the topic of discussion first.
Yeah, thanks, Avi. I just wanted to add that there is a kind of clear process outlined for when duplicate assets are detected. So that should be outlined in the contractual terms.
Okay, great, cool. Thanks very much. That's really helpful detail.
Sandy.
Thanks, Reese. Sandy.
So yeah, quick one on the same subject as that, I guess. So in EDF, we obviously have consumers, but we, for example, optimize like Fusion connected batch energy storage systems on behalf of asset owners, for example. And I guess like that reasonable endeavors, I can imagine it being quite hard to like keep a track of reports, just especially like in the future if we have like a virtual e-party world. And so I think on top of that as well, we've got different marketplaces like Electron, Piccolo, EPEX. I think in terms of managing our registers, it can become a little bit complex. I guess like is having some sort of like standardized common asset register within the scope of something like the Open Networks program, or is that something wider or more cross-cutting? Because yeah, I can imagine it being difficult to keep track of it all the time.
I think the short answer is that this is clearly underway, and I know Nina's back on camera, so I'm sure she'll probably have something to say on that. But our view is that efforts are already underway, perhaps led by Dejnes or Ofgem. So our view is that we should dovetail and ensure that our efforts are additive as opposed to trying to do or repeat the same thing over. So we noted that as a perhaps a requirement, and you'll probably see it in few other topics like in Dispatch API or the likes. So it's always useful to have a unique identifier for asset like a passport number or the like. So that then becomes a thing you can take through in all our activities there. But we are not trying to do that just yet because we can very easily focus our efforts on something else and inherit the outcomes of the automatic asset register or the other initiatives that perhaps Nina will just jump in to speak on.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Sandy. So yeah, thank you very much for raising it. And I think, yeah, as Avi kind of mentions there's previous commitments from DESNZ in the energy digitalization strategy around streamlining asset registration, making it more common, considering what kind of central asset registers might be needed to support not just kind of flexibility, but also a bunch of other use cases like network planning. I know Pat earlier was like, you connecting up with other registers. So from a policy perspective, that kind of thinking is happening and is ongoing, mostly led by DESNZ. But yeah, there is going to be an upcoming consultation from Ofgem, fingers crossed, next week. I think we're allowed to say that. So please do keep an eye out. I've grabbed your email and I'll put you on our stakeholder list if that's helpful, Sandy. And if there's anyone else who's particularly keen, pop your email in the chat if that's okay to steal your chat a little bit, because yeah, we'll be putting out some kind of policy consultations around what might be needed to support this kind of standardization and common approaches of assets registering for DSO and ESO flexibility markets, trying to make it easier in that space for providers. So yeah, drop me a line if anyone's keen to be in on that, but there should be lots of comms and you'll see it.
Thank you.
Adson?
Hi, sorry. Thank you. I just wanted to point out that this is a project that we have been working on from Electrolink's perspective. Some of guest attendees may be aware of it because it's something that we have identified in terms of the commercial allocation of domestic and non-domestic small scale. And the need for this sort of like single source of truth that can be kind of like tracked closer to real time. So yeah, just to highlight or to put it in the radar in case anyone would like to follow up about it, because that's something that we are actually doing. With it has been sort of like targeted more from the network and the FSPs kind of like perspective, but not from the FSPs to consumers. And so that's kind of like a gap that we're trying to fill there. Thank you.
Thanks, Axel. I think I'll probably reach out to you offline because I know you've raised it in the past and we've picked up on some of the points, but I personally have not fully got my head around the actual the remit of the program you mentioned. So I'll try and catch up with you offline just to get my head around so that I'm ensure that these things are fed into very organically with our work as well. Thanks for
Absolutely. That. Yeah, happy to follow up, Thank you.
Thanks. Moving on then. So the next big challenge on our hands was essentially the consistency of flexibility products that the DNOs procure. So this is again a challenge because quite often from what emerged from our experience was that while each DNO, in the interest of getting more participation in there, adopted some of the feedback that the flex service provider gave them in their license area, and it emerged that there were quite a few variation and interpretation of the flex products that were out there that was getting in the way of, if, for example, product one, when it was called as product one in DNO one, was not necessarily like for like replacement in the DNO across a different license area, for instance. So that was emerging as a barrier for us. So identifying the need to have it consistent is something that obviously was perhaps a low-hanging fruit, and equally important to ensure that many of the other activities we perform, whether it's stackability or primacy, is built on the standardization of these products. So it was crucial for us to review this and to be very explicit and clear on what each of these products will constitute, so that all the things that build further on from this is built on a firm foundation. So setting that as our ambition, we then rebranded or recreated new products. The reason I say recreated is we did have standards in the past, like many of you would know, we had secure, dynamic, sustain, restore. Those 4 standard products were the ones that is being procured across DNOs. But it was made clear to us that the nuances that each DNOs then deployed in the way these are procured essentially gave the impression that they were not identical at all. And that was something that we needed to address, and we need to get together to do it. Second one is that it is the way the products were published and utilized or like marketed. It was not necessarily clear what it did. Like, for instance, we called it secure and sustain. So we then took the best practice from ESO to call the products by what it actually does. So peak reduction, it does what peak reduction says. So we thought there's an opportunity to improve in there as well. So we then came up with these products now, the new products that all the DNOs are going to be procuring going forward, similar to the question that Sandy asked earlier, or that since the launch, every tender going forward will be on these products. And we are then currently ensuring that the migration or what criteria for retiring any of the new ones or bringing in new products, because DNOs are always looking to innovate, and we're trying to make the market as inclusive as possible. So there are some DNOs exploring how do you bring in more domestic consumers, for instance, and the like. So I do need. I'm coming to that one. So how are we going to get to that sort of bridge that gap is the challenge we had. So we then came up with a clear articulation of what the products are, what requirement from the networks is it solving. So historically, our approach to develop these products were essentially what business case or what essential network requirement is this solving. But the way the FSP saw it was not necessarily what business case it is solving, is what performance that their assets are going to be delivering is the way they saw it. So we needed to turn the dial and see the world in their perspective. So we've gone away and done that, and then also equally mapped the payment structures, whether it's utilization only or availability and utilization, to then essentially make it clear on what are the revenue streams coming to it. So hopefully this, Nina, is the bit that you were after. So while I've mapped what is the existing, say, scheduled utilization, underneath I've written sustain, but it's a huge caveat with like 5-6 stars on there, because that itself was the problem. The fact that sustain of, say, UKPN was not necessarily identical to sustain of NGED, perhaps. So I'm just using UKPN and NGED as examples. I'm not saying that they are or they're not, but because of that variation, while in principle that particular product can be mapped to sustain, it's not to say that's a one-to-one replacement. We are very clear and articulate on what the technical specs now of these new products are: peak reduction, scheduled utilization, operational utilization, standard availability, and variable availability. And in operation, if you see from a flex service provider, when is the availability agreed, what is the refinement, when is the utilization agreed, and what is the delivery method, is the bit that typically people tend to have variations on. There are needs and there's ambition to move to closer to real time. So some people who are in the detail end of things will call out that, yes, you standardize these 5 products, but depending on whether you procure it right 2 minutes in advance or week ahead, there's going to be a huge variation in the process. We are aware of that, but it's essential right now, because the view was that if in the interest of standardization, if you cut out some of these things, it is going to eat into the existing market. So our ambition was essentially to standardize in the intent of market proliferation, but it would be detrimental to our cause if we go away and actually eat into existing assets there. But that is a conversation that's currently underway, because it's not necessarily been completely resolved to say that, yes, there is that particular asset giving this particular service, but can it not give the new one that we are looking to standardize on? And that is a transition we are looking to achieve, where we are currently studying the market over the next 6 months to determine which of these sort of variations, if you will, need to be terminated, whether it's the criteria for termination also is equally important, whether it's the volumes, whether it's the whatever other criteria that comes in. We are trying to be clear on, here are the standard products. All the specs are clear in terms of what it is the ask from flex service providers. And going forward, we will then come up with a view of which of these things, based on our market engagement over 6 to 8 odd months of one round of tender for all DNOs, we will then have some sort of view saying that, okay, which of these things we thought there was interest and volumes, but we have not got anything, so we should probably look to retire that. That's the approach we've taken. In terms of deployment, these, like I mentioned, are being deployed across all networks right now, doing the tender rounds. But the way we set it out is that we think that there is still room for innovation. So in the ambition to make it 100% standardized, we didn't want to stifle some of the key challenges that we still face in bringing in certain other demographic into the flex market, like domestic, for instance. So the way the DNOs have committed right now, with 80% of volume of flex that they're procuring going forward since Jan of 2024 is going to be with these products. But there'll be 20% where they'll still try out some new product that they think has value. And if it is seen as a viable product where there's interest from the market, or there is a substantial impact on the network, we'll bring back to the conversation with an open networks to then make that a new standard product. Or equally, like I mentioned, if some of the product is deemed as not fit for purpose, there's no interest or uptake on it, we can then retire that as well. So that the products that are going to be procured at any given time is representative of the need of the networks and the need of the flex service provider at any given time, is the approach that we've taken. So this is the the approach that we have gone for flex products. One thing I'd like to flag is that each of these are currently, I'm giving you a very high level summary of it. There's a report that sits behind each of this in terms of the assessment we've gone, how we've mapped, what are the variations we found, and why we've gone down the route of getting each of these specific specification is there in a report. And we are also looking to strip that down to bare minimum of a standard and put that in the repository that holds the engineering recommendation as well, so that there's a single source of truth. I'll touch upon that later on in another slide, but I want to be clear that there is a lot of content behind the slides that I'm producing or I'm sharing right now for you to go away and perhaps tear apart some of the nuances that I have not managed to cover in the quick overview of these products here. Again, I'll pause before I move to the next session. Any questions?
No questions in the chat, Abby.
Understood. I shall. So in the interest of time, I probably need to speed up, but this is a big ticket item. So I'll spend some time on primacy and stackability and interoperability. These are big ticket items. It'll probably take 20 odd minutes, but I'll gloss over the next bit quite quickly in the interest of time. But again, if I see that the tension we have in the meeting is quite good. So if you think that there's value in me continuing at the same pace, with the expense of extending 10 odd minutes, which is actually on the placeholder anyhow, I can crack on. But if you believe that it's good to crack or cover off within the hour, I can do that as well. But for now, I'm going to the big ticket items now, which is primacy and stackability. Before we go down what we are doing, I think I'll take this opportunity to essentially talk about what is primacy and stackability, because I've been in this conversation and talking to stakeholders for a while. So it's very common for people to articulate, okay, primacy and stackability are big ticket items for everybody. But when you go to the details, I think there's a opportunity for us all to have consistent understanding of what is primacy and stackability. So I've tried to put, again, like a broad brushstroke, sort of consolidation of what each of them are. So in terms of stackability and primacy, one of the easiest ways that I find to look at this is it's one is an internal management of proximity and technical conflicts. The other one is more a commercial element where an FSP can then stack or revenue can be optimized based on which of the markets they can access. So both are different measures of market coordination, but both are trying to come at it from a different side of things. So stackability essentially is how a single asset can sell their service to multiple buyers. And primacy is essentially how the operator has to optimize or what rules they have to set up to ensure that the assets that are electrical proximity don't necessarily conflict or counteract each other. So that's the key difference. So if you go to the detail of it, so if you look at seller buyer in the explicit market model, primacy is essentially the rules that need to be established, whether it's between DSO and ESO services or between ESO service or DSO service itself. These are the rules that need to be established such that the dispatch of any service doesn't then trigger any other further any whether technical or commercial barriers that then are okay. Sorry. The privacy rules essentially are rules that need to be set up to ensure that dispatch of a service doesn't then trigger any additional technical or commercial barriers within that market. So this could be one asset participating in both, whether that same asset has the contract with DSO and ESO. It could be two separate assets with one with DSO, one with ESO. So the permutation is quite a lot, but essentially these are the rules that need to happen. And this is perhaps more process driven and data driven, which we've come to learn from our current exercise. And stackability on the other side is from a flex service provider's perspective, it is to say what options do they have in terms of participating in multiple markets simultaneously. So we will be publishing an updated report shortly over in a week or two max. So this is for somebody who's been close to this area. I think last year Enged produced a report in partnership with Cornwall Insights on some of the work that they've done in the past. So we've worked with the same consultant and the same report to then essentially update that to have a consistent starting point for this conversation because we wanted to be clear that this is our starting point. These are the considerations that we have on, like, for example, what does stackability actually constitute? Whether it's earning revenues by the same asset jumping services, or it's splitting the capacity of one asset across markets, or it's a case of delivering the same the resource across potential multiple revenues, but in the same direction of service, whether it's co-delivery, splitting, or jumping. So which of them are currently feasible, which of them cannot be what we call explicit and implicit stackability. Those things are currently being published in the latest terminology and with the latest Flex products. So that then becomes the starting point. We will then identify key barriers working with the ESO and DSOs to say what are the things that we can do systemically to ensure that the opportunity to stack is optimized from an FSP's perspective. So this is the key bifurcation, and we are currently the state of play is we've been into the primacy journey for a while, and our approach has been that we went with increments 1 and 2, where it is a case of understanding what we're dealing with and what does it actually constitute. So we initially in the primacy rule 1, we took a high impact, high probability, and we've implemented that just to see what it constitutes. So we did a lot of impact assessment and the likes. And Nina.
Just a really quick clarification. If you could click back one slide. The wording for splitting and co-delivery were exactly the same. For splitting, did you mean not the same megawatt, and co-delivery, did you mean yes, the same megawatt? Is there an extra
so
not in
splitting
there?
Is different megawatts from same asset. So if I have 10 units, let's say 5 for one market and 5 for the other, co-delivery would be is 5, but is the same 5 coming to both the markets. That was my interpretation. But again,
exactly. So I think there's just an extra not on the slide. Is that so? The co-delivery
that's me. Sorry, that's just me being sorry.
So the co-delivery
the intention is jumping is where
megawatt.
One asset jumps from one market to the other. Splitting is one asset, 10 units, split that across markets. Co-delivery is same megawatts into 2 markets potentially. So co-delivery is perhaps the most complicated, because the debate of should the FSP receive payment twice for the same megawatt and the like. So our view is that yes, we need to have the conversation, but if stackability is to be solved, we probably need to resolve jumping and splitting first. So we will tackle that first and then get to this is the approach.
Awesome, makes sense. And then just minor wording change then before circulating.
Yeah.
Sweet, that's beautiful. Thank you.
And then where was I? Sorry. So we had the iteration 1 and 2, increment 1 and 2 with we were working on, where we picked up we went the route of use cases. So what we did was we mapped all the different services on X and Y axis in a I say X and Y axis. Okay, rows and columns in an Excel sheet, and it came out to be 2,600 odd use cases, because every potential permutation of all the services is a potential rule that we need to develop. Whether its impact is not likely or not high impact is something that we need to determine. But those were the number of use cases we originally started with. And given the complexity of the condition, we need to start somewhere. So we went with the approach of going with use cases. In hindsight, perhaps that was not necessarily optimum route, but we've learned from that, and I'll tell you what we're doing next as well. But as things stand, we then went down the route of increments, where we were picking up use cases and coming up with rules for them. So in here, there are 3 aspects of development. First of all is the development of the rules itself. So we have service 1, service 2, the technical and commercial aspects of it. What are the different rules that needs to be developed and what are the impact of it? And then selecting the rule that is going to be deployed. So that's one exercise. The next one is the actual implementation of it, meaning what data needs to be shared and where is that data originating, where does it need to go to ensure that that rule can be deployed. And third one is something that we'll probably come up on in the near future as a program as a whole, is how do you then govern these rules? Because right now, for example, there are assets that, as things stand, primacy rule is not mandated, it's not codified, but then suppose there are different behavioral patterns that are codified. How does that then play out with other 3 different categories of conversation that needs to happen? So our focus has been on the first 2. So we then look to understand what kind of effort goes into developing these rules and how much of assessment is needed for us to have confidence of one impact over the other. And then next exercise was essentially identifying the data sets and then making that data transfer across the boundaries of whether TND, ESO, DSO, or FSP, DSO, and the likes need to be resolved. So from the first two increments, our ambition was second increment to have somewhere around 700 use cases, but we had to tone that down for several reasons. The first one was that some of the old services that was in the ESO portfolio was obsolete. So in the 700 use cases that we had identified, several of them were now no longer relevant because those products were obsolete. So we had taken them out. And we also discovered that some of the data sets we needed to deploy those privacy rules, even though the rules are developed, is not necessarily available to actually deploy the rules. So the rules exist and we can deploy it so long as the data is available, but to source that information from where it is and then make it available to the right parties to ensure the deployment is something that we've learned to become a challenge. So having put together all the learning of increment 1 and 2 and noting that the urgency of this is quite imminent and we need to get this sorted ASAP, we've now taken the route of sort of turning the dial around. We now know what the deployment and development constitute. So we are looking to disaggregate the development of the rules and implementation of it. So we'll probably secure additional resource for us to go away and develop the rules and have all the rules developed in a consistent format, and also have an impact assessment of these rules such that there's a like for like comparison and it's a consistent one. And then we will prioritize the development of the rules based on the data that's already available with us, because quite a few of them, in order to make the data available, there needs to be some sort of infrastructure, investment from the network. So yes, there are rules that needs to be deployed, but even if you do develop those rules, if the data is not available, since we can't deploy it, and we have to get through a lot of use cases, our approach is that if you can prioritize the data that's available, whilst the network can then focus on making that data that's currently not available back onto the table, we can then ensure that the pace is managed. So we'll continue developing the rules and identifying what data is required to deploy these rules. And our first prioritization would be that in the data that's already available in the different platforms that ESO or DSO are currently using, and then pipeline the data that we identify such that we can then keep progressing with this. And then the last bit of governance is something that we'll have to come together as an industry, perhaps with the regulator and the government, to see how best to codify this. And that's probably a conversation that we'll need to be having sooner rather than later. But it is not a direct dependency for us to do what we're actually signed up to do. So we're basically putting our heads down and to get this sorted. So that's our current plan. So iteration 3 is where we are moving away from use case 1, 2, 3 approach, wherein here's a data set. We're trying to group them such that if the data set required to deploy rules for, say, 5 use cases are similar, we'll group them and then develop that and go forward such that we are able to not repeat the mistakes that we've learned from increment 1 and 2. That's the state of play for primacy. And in terms of stackability, we'll just about lock the report that I mentioned is a good starting point and a conversation starter. Like I said, it's an update of the Enged Cornwall Insights earlier report. It's authored by the same external consultant, so that there's good transfer of experience and learning as well. It's just that it's up to date in terms of what we know is the state of play from all the different things we're doing in the, say, Flex products, for instance, and our ambitions. So we have a focus group planned on the 20th. For those who don't know, focus groups typically are areas where we have detailed technical conversation of this specific topic, and technically anybody is free to join that session based on their availability and interest. But it is a case where you then speak out of the different priorities and the nuances of things that I've certainly not captured in this call here. So if somebody's interested, please drop me or Reese or just anybody in Open Networks a line, and we'll definitely be able to put you on that list. And that's something we're doing. So our steps right now is trying to be looking at systemic things we can do, because one of the learnings from primacy is that if you go down the route of use case by use case, we are never going to crack stackability, because the sheer number of permutations, you can stack 3 layers. So it's just too many. So we have to tackle this systemically. So we are currently looking at the ones I mentioned, Nina, where we know is a clear, where you can take on the low hanging fruits, and the more complex one, we'll need to talk about it, but we'll come to that when there is time and place for that. But we want to target on quick wins. And when I say target quick wins, is deployment and not just saying, oh, we're going to be talking about this. Our ambition I think the current plan, which is currently in circulation, is that by Jan of 2025, we would have identified what the quick wins are and deployed them by that time. So, but if you ask me now on call what those quick wins are, TBC is where, because that's literally the conversation we had, I think, last week and this week as well. So we will be talking about that in the next couple of weeks in the program anyhow. But this is obviously very interesting and fast moving area of work. So watch this space is all I'll say on this. I'll pause here before I go to the next item if anybody has questions. If not, we are off to the next big ticket item, which is the interoperability of flexibility in general. So this journey started off way back in 2022, I suppose, wherein we were coming together as networks to see what is it we need to do to move towards closer to real time, procurement. What are the steps that we need to take? And at the back of that, we had, those who have involved with open networks in the past, we had a consultation every year. Over the last 2 years, we were drawn that given just the number of consultations that's flying about, and we figured talking to stakeholders is perhaps a better way to get that feedback and better use of their time. But back in the day when we had consultation, September 2022, we had a consultation where the interoperability across the different systems in flexibility were seen as a substantially a big challenge as a whole. So while we were grappling with how do you unpack this big problem of interoperability, we then saw from our own prioritization and the different work that was underway with Desnes and the likes was the fact that what we can target is pick up one big ticket item and then incrementally develop that. So we went down the route of trying to scope out standardization of how do we then improve dispatch of flex services, or how do we improve that? And the view was that setting up a standard API for dispatch of flex services across GBPLC, if you will, would be the best way for it. So we set out on this journey back in 2023, where we got some external help to initially engage the market and understand what the ask is and what could be the potential, off-the-shelf items we can use. So we set out with the ambition that there are currently, different APIs already in use, whether it's to the different portals or different DNOs have different APIs that are currently underway. So we went down to the market and have a conversation with the FSPs to understand, are there any winners in terms of existing APIs out there that we can pick and deploy and say, here's the winner, we all vote this, and then we will go away and deploy this across the board. So having gone through the exercise, having spoken to the stakeholders, a couple of things emerged from that engagement was that we did receive some recommendation of some APIs, but predominantly the feedback we got was, I guess, using an example, we asked what car do you want, and they gave us different features of the car that they wanted. So we have then been using that as a guiding principle. So some of those models, if you will, the API standards that were recommended, we tested that, but we then found that they were either, not necessarily scalable or not fit for purpose in terms of the ambition we're trying to do. There's a detailed report that we've put together in terms of all the options and what the outcome from the stakeholder engagement is. Happy to share that, and I intend to bring that all together in a more accessible format in the near future, because it's not necessarily easy to go through the journey with us, because if there are 6 reports, you're downloading them, it's probably hard for you to map out which is the report 1 and 2 because it's a sequence. So that's some other feedback we received. So we're putting it all together such that we've gone through this journey. Why we started where we are now is consolidated in one. I'll come to that anyway. So through this journey, when we got to the end of 2023, it became clear to us that there isn't any clear off-the-shelf item that we can pick and deploy. So in the interest of time and urgency, we got ahead of ourselves in a little bit, and we essentially went to our stakeholders, Ofgem and Desnes, said that in order to be aggressive, the best way we can do this is we have to develop an API of our own, like just start from and do our thing and deploy that across. And we had a constructive challenge at the time to say that if we are going to do this and if it's going to be fit for purpose, it has to be internationally compatible, because whilst we are focusing on our targets, there's an entire supply chain sitting behind this entire flex market that we need to take into account and not just create something because we set ourselves a deadline for April, for instance. So given that constructive challenge, we then took a step back and reviewed the existing international standards out there that we think can be scaled up to what we call GB profile. So the approach we took on there was oh, well, here are the benefits and why APIs were actually being deployed. So essentially, it's a case of, for every DNO or every FSP can essentially have this embedded such that they can then operate that from one platform across different markets, and it is very much aligned to the aspiration to move to real time as well. So there are opportunities to optimize, wherein suppose we do develop this API and they need to deploy this within their systems. There's obviously an opportunity for a third party to develop the entire plugin black box to say, here's the portal that DNOs use, here is your asset, and here's the black box that just does the translation kind of thing. So there are opportunities, and we are very much mindful of the fact that our spec should not ring fence any specific player or any specific technology for that particular entity. But anyhow, we'll come to that. So our approach has been gated. And the reason we went down the gated approach and not a typical Gantt chart of a project management is simply because we were discovering our way through the entire process. So we can't make a commitment till we know actually what we are dealing with. So our first essential step was, having received the feedback that we need to prioritize international standards, or we need to scrutinize international standards to see if we can adopt that as an option. We then took out the approach where we used the stakeholder feedback saying that, okay, here are the features that all the stakeholders have collectively told us are needed in the APIs. So we use the international standard to say, okay, this particular standard doesn't comply with some of the feedback we received. So if some of the features that was given to us is not met by the international standard, that was the reason for our elimination. So we went on the route of elimination. So incidentally, the timing was really good, because in that process of elimination, we had OpenADR 3 launch in December of 2023, and we were performing this exercise pretty much between Feb and March. So when we performed the first assessment of existing standard out there, OpenADR 3 was not available. But it was then found that OpenADR 3 was perhaps the most viable option among the elimination criteria we went through. And that is also documented, and you can have access to that if you're interested. So having done that, the DNOs and the ESOs were keen to ensure that we're able to sense check or sort of de-risk to say that, can OpenADR 3 effectively dispatch the services we have in mind now? And are we inadvertently creating any barriers for the scaling of the interoperability conversation as a whole? Because we as a program, we've prioritized dispatch APIs as a priority, but APIs can then do much more, whether it's in settlement, whether it's in pre-qualification and the like. So that's not lost on us. So we want to be sure that whilst our focus is on dispatch, because that in itself is a big ticket item and it's a lot of effort, but we should not be putting barriers for the future steps of scale up that we may not have thought of now. So we went down the route of Gate B, where each DNO went away, did their internal due diligence to check that, can OpenADR 3 dispatch the existing services that we have, the standard ones. And equally, the ESO have also been part of this conversation to say the relevant products that they have in mind, can OpenADR 3 dispatch. So this is not to say here how we are going to deploy it. It's a case of a confidence building in the case that, okay, so far every exercise we are doing, OpenADR 3 is coming out on top to say, yes, it can fulfill. So it's a case of us trying to find out, is there a way or is there a reason for us to eliminate this or disregard? This is the approach we've been taking on. So that is the thing that we concluded in May, wherein it was clear to us that OpenADR 3 can effectively do and deliver all these things. And we are currently in Gate C, which is essentially trying to understand what does deployment of this look like. So that is also a fairly detailed conversation. We're currently deep in this conversation now, is having decided that OpenADR 3 is something we're going to be creating as GBPLC. It is clear that as of now, the OpenADR 3 syntax has the key bits criteria that has been handed to us, like messages, event message, and the REST API. I am not a data person, so if you have any questions, I'll be the first to say I have no clue. I'll have to take it away. But having been in the conversation, I'll pass on my understanding of this so that, whatever questions you have, it is really useful and we can take that away. So from the OpenADR 3, we then have to build up other aspects of it in order to use for the dispatch, which is we need to have security, authentication, technical architecture, and the endpoint behavior and business processes established for this. And our approach to this is currently code development. So we are looking to set up, I guess, an extrapolation of what we call a focus group, where we will formally set up a group with external stakeholders who are directly and indirectly impacted with this. This also has the actual OpenADR 3 team themselves. So they are also part of this conversation, because they are keen to ensure that what we do then can be adopted in their OpenADR 3 as a standard going forward. Although not a commitment, but that's the ambition. But the fact that they're fully engaged in every part of our conversation is really useful and something that that was a something we're really encouraged by. And currently where we are at is that if we go away and perform all the blue boxes there, we can essentially have the dispatch OpenAD API locked. And then as a next phase, we can then pick up the settlement and pre-qualification that could be OpenADR 3 as a scale up, but need not necessarily be, because we haven't necessarily performed that entire exercise in as much of depth or not. But in any case, there is still benefit of having this as a consistent dispatch API across GB, because that is a huge concern for interoperability of different platforms, for instance, right now. The state of play as of now is we're currently scoping out the resource and required for it. When I say resource, both time and money, it is substantially more than what we had originally planned, because of the level of co-development we're trying to do, because we want to be sure that we take on board the input from all the different platforms and the potential black box developers and the likes to ensure that what we do is actually fit for purpose, that everybody can sign off and go away and deploy. Because if you're going to be spending that much time and money, it ideally should be something we can, with great confidence say is going to be deployed, and not like we've done this, but there are a few other concerns which is getting in the way and can't be done. So in order to develop that level of confidence and commitments, I'm currently mapping out what is the optimal route to get that done. So if you are interested and want to have this conversation, we have focus group on a monthly basis for this. My ambition is to come back to the focus group next month to present a plan of what the delivery could look like, to sense check to see whether are we ambitious enough or are we too ambitious, what could be the pitfalls and challenges going down this route for us. That's the state of play for us in the API space. I'll pause before jumping into the next one again. Nina.
Hi, really great diagram. Really, really helpful to see what's there and what can be pulled over and what bits are new. And yeah, really appreciate that kind of international look and international alignment, because I think that delivers value for the sector. So thanks for doing all of that work. I think just to do that kind of messaging and emphasis, that as you're kind of showing here, what we want to do as much as possible is take what already exists and just pull out, and they call it profiling, the key bits that we want to use to make like a GB. I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's like there's a menu and we're picking the set menu that GB would like, but it's still from that a la carte menu.
Right.
So that as much as possible. And really great that OpenADR is so engaged in that if there are like additional GB specific things, they're considering writing them into the menu so that other people can use it in future. Because I do think a lot of the time GB is leading, particularly in that explicit flexibility stuff. And so hopefully this is like good business development for OpenADR, frankly, because they'll hopefully, then other countries can be like, oh, that profile is good for us too. I guess I just wanted to flag the stuff in light blue to the far left, like security, authentication, technical architecture. I just again caution about like developing an open network specific or a GB specific approach to authentication, technical architecture. Like I'm sure there's approaches out there. And again, it would be good to like look what people are doing and try and use them first, so that again, the more consistency across the piece, where that's sound from a security perspective, is good from a user and deployment perspective. And then thoughts on alignment, like I always think about networks at the top, aggregators in the middle, and then the assets at the bottom. And the SSES Smart Secure Electricity System program, I don't know how much engagement you've had with that.
I'll answer there are several points you made, Nina. I'll go in sequence. I think the first point is that the way we're approaching it, and OpenADR 3 is very much in the same sentiment that I don't want to put words in their mouth, but that's pretty much the same sentiment they're coming along. And we are considering deploying what we call a reference implementation as well, so that the journey for the FSPs when they are adopting this is something that they can just pick and drop, as opposed to a new discovery phase for them. But again, the challenge is that, what does it cost and how do we go about it? That's a huge question, because this is not a small change that we're dealing with. A substantial amount of effort and money is going to go in. So I'm just trying to scope that out. So that is very much in train. And the Dropbox, the way you mentioned, is we currently have that mapped. I think it's obviously not for this presentation here, but if you're interested, I'm happy to share that we have a a detailed breakup of individual activities and subtasks and time allocation for these different blue boxes there. So that, because in order for us to quantify what we are doing, how long we're doing, I've just gone about to the networks quite recently and said, I probably need like, 2-3 FTs and the like. So in order for me to make that case, I had to go down that level of granularity, but I'm happy to share that with you if that's useful and for you to challenge that as well.
More just from a technical perspective in terms of looking internationally and seeing what's there.
On an SSES point, we've been keeping an eye out on that. So this 2-pager that you obviously can't see here, that 2-pager actually sets out what our remit is, what SSES remit is, and how it meant to join. So when SSES kicked off, our view was that that's happening. We're aware of it. We'll keep an eye, and we'll do this, and such that if you are starting at the two ends of a river, we sort of meet in the middle, sort of the approach. So that worst outcome is like, both don't kind of align, sort of thing. So while we have been grappling with our kind of planning exercise, our ambition is to reach out to SSES for a detailed workshop, even if it's just to communicate what we're doing. But having said that, SSES, some of the reps have been part of our focus group. So they have asked some questions, and I think they have been slightly more proactive than I have been, to be completely, open here, is the fact that they've absorbed what we are doing, and we have then passed on the SSES consultation to the group, so that to identify what exactly is happening there, and are there anything that that we need to flag right now with the work that they are doing. So, we can then take it on. The ambition right now is to, once we have this plan locked, I have a plan workshop with the stakeholders first, and then with the SSES team themselves to say, here's the plan, here's what we intend to do, and do you have any views and do you have any suggestions, sort of thing. So we intend to workshop with their team, so that if not anything else, we can just present and we know what they are doing and they know what we are doing, and then that essentially de-risks that.
Great. A two-way sharing would be really good, as you say, so it meets in the middle, because that feels sensible to me. If you need any support with getting the right contacts at SSES, drop me an email. Super happy to support that. But I think that's really, the meeting in the middle just seems sensical. It would seem nonsensical not to do it. And I guess same kind of point upstream around ESO aligning with single markets platform and open balancing platform, same kind of conversations. And there it's not like a meeting in the middle. It's like not having two streams, just having one stream, which is kind of classic open networks project stuff.
So from the ESO side, the way we're going about it is that obviously they have multiple platforms and the like. So their approach has been that everything they're very much involved and fully engaged with what we're doing, and they're doing the same sensec as we are. And our sort of perimeter of operation is ideal is that if they deploy this for their dispatches as well, but they obviously have much bigger portfolio where that may or may not be possible. That's still, they are doing a cost benefit analysis and impact assessment right now, which we will obviously take into account. And I know from the focus group, some of them are keen to see how it maps, and that input from that exercise is something they're keen to engage with. But the way we've drawn the line to say to keep the pace is that at the very least, ESO should be compatible, or their process should be compatible, so that assets that are in distribution and participate in the DSO market should be able to use this standard, even if ESO in their remit of accessing markets in transmission choose to use a different API, if that is the decision. The ambition is to have it same, but even if they were to diverge, given that there is still benefit and all the DNOs having consistent API, the ask would be is that the perimeter of all the assets within the distribution will then comply with this. So that seems to be a sensible middle ground for now, keeping the ambition to keep it across the market. But that is subject to a lot of assessment that we can't make a formal commitment. So we're like, that's fair. We'll go away and take a look.
Cool. No, really clear, super understood. And again, any support we can do to kind of try and smooth alignment, that's great. I'm conscious of time, but probably people are dropping off. So sorry for taking up space. Thank you very much. Really helpful today.
Thanks. I'll quickly whiz through because we have these slides and I'll walk through. So the next bit of the standardization exercise we were performing is on the settlement, because this is perhaps, I guess, fundamentally the most big ticket item. End of the day, this is where the money comes from, isn't it? So we are trying to make sure that different aspects of our overall processes are consistent. And I guess one of the things that I'd like to call out is as simple as the formula that we use to calculate availability and utilization, for instance. So that is a formula that we've worked with the stakeholders to come up with and will then be deployed shortly. And these are the different parameters that we are looking to standardize. So happy for you to engage with us offline if necessary. And the last part I had was essentially the information that's currently made available out there. So many of them we've already deployed and landed. But this also you can read offline because most of them are either in the implementation or going to be, imminently implemented. But what I will spend time on, if I can afford the time, is the actual impact of this work. I've kept it at the end because it is a journey, and I wanted to actually start with where we've gone in the journey and where we've landed. I've been debating whether we start with a splash saying, look how awesome we are, but that probably would be too much of a PR exercise rather than the actual journey. So I know I've lost 15 members already, so probably in retrospect, not the best decision. But in any case, here is the stats that we published last month. And I think this is really encouraging for several reasons. What you can see on the left are towers of contracted and tendered flexibility. The orange towers were on the rise right from the start, where that's the DNOs essentially increasing the amount of flexibility they're looking to procure. So that is very much in line with the approach where we are going with the flex first approach. So there, that commitment is clearly established. But what is equally important to note is that somewhere in 2022, we noticed that the blue bar is sort of hitting a glass ceiling. So the efforts we're put in over the last 18 months is now showing it's the benefits clear on the market, is because if you see the 2022-23 figure is around 2 gigawatts, and now we are potentially close to 4 gigawatts in terms of contract. That's a huge jump from where we are. We managed to unlock flexibility that was potentially not at the cusp of participating, but have not participated. So that's really a useful information for us. And another bit on the right is the technology split. So only 11% of the entire technology split actually is coming from fossil fuel. So the rest of it is from non-fossil fuel sources, which is equally hugely encouraging, because fundamentally this flexibility market is one of the key linchpin in encouraging low carbon technology accessing the network. So this then makes a positive business case for them to do that. I know you have many people dropping off. Any questions on this? If not, my last slide is our next step is we're looking to essentially articulate all this in terms of DSO and FSP journey. And we are trying to come together and essentially come up with a user journey on a website somewhere. And I want to get your view on whether there is value in having such a thing, and whether you think there's going to be, how do you like to use it and how you'd like to shape that, or something I'll get to talk about. But noting the time where we're at, I'll just say that watch this space. And if you have any views and thoughts on how we can shape this, please reach out to me, because it's something I'm currently working on. This is meant to be an FSP facing or website where either existing or new FSPs can come along saying, if they Google, okay, what is Flex Market and how do I participate? This is a one-stop solution for everything that's having that information and have the latest reports from all the work that we're doing in open networks. I will leave you with a Slido poll that's useful for us. It'll be open for the entire week, so that when you receive the slides offline, I'm happy for you to go away and put this on. This is essentially for us to identify, how useful was the session and which segment of industry do you belong to, so that we then can funnel your impact, your inputs on to optimize the impact for our program in general. I'll stop there to take any final questions. If not, please do log into this and reach out to us on any questions, thoughts, or feedback you have. I'll be more than happy to talk in any of these topics in greater depth. But thank you so much for your time this morning. If there's nothing else, happy to drop off. Thank you so much for your time. Bye.
Thank you. Everybody. Any thoughts and reflections?
Do you want to stop the recording, Ali?
I think it was Autumn who did it, but I can stop. Was it me?
I've done it.